Wellington, although now, so he says, heavily retired but working more than full-time, I'm sure. Perhaps you also might know that he is a prolific writer and most recently written A Radically Different World, Preparing for Climate Change in the Bridget Williams book series, which really deals with, what's their tagline? Is like big ideas, small books, big ideas, I can't remember what it is. But a wonderful book series that really does deep dives into issues facing Aotearoa, New Zealand as a whole, or locally, regionally, and you'll have received also a book that is very much based in this region, which is here. But Jonathan, we've invited him and he's graciously agreed to spend some time with us because he has done quite a lot of work in this space around climate adaptation. I'll let him introduce what he's done, but just to say for our purposes, what we had asked him to do is to really help us think through the remit of this assembly. And by remit, we mean what is the question you're having to deal with? And that question is broad, right? It's a really big one put in front of you about fairness. And what is fairness? So when something like a cyclone blows through and affects everybody, but not in the same way, people's lives are... What does it mean to fix things in a fair and just way? And knowing that this type of event is only going to happen more often, we know that there are transitions ahead of us. We have to change the way we do things. Business as usual is really not an option. So Jonathan's going to talk about that, but really help you think through what are the concepts and the principles and the tools that we can use to sort of wrestle with this idea of fairness and a just transition to something that is not business as usual. So I'm going to hand it to you, Jonathan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christiane. Morena, kia ora, ko Jonathan Boston Aho. It's a real honour and privilege to be here. I'm sorry to say it's only the second time I've been to Brisbane. We had a family holiday here 29 years ago, and I'm sorry we've not been back, but I'm delighted to be here, and given the weather yesterday and today, and I live in Wellington, I'm definitely going to be back. Okay, so the topic of fairness is huge, and I appreciate there's a wealth of expertise here in the room. So I hope this can be as much a kind of a dialogue rather than me pontificating. I've got some slides. I've got a short version which I'm going to go through in the next 15 minutes or so, but there is a longer version which Harley has got, and they will be made available to you. This topic is a big one. It's complex, it's multifaceted, it's controversial. It has a very long history in human civilizations. There are different perspectives that you'll find now, but looking back over thousands of years, different ideas about the nature of fairness and justice. I can't possibly do topic justice in 15 minutes, so this is just going to be a sort of a quick high-level perspective, but I hope it will help kind of frame your thinking and discussion for the rest of today, but also over the coming month. Just by way of background, I'm a policy generalist. I've written and worked on a whole variety of issues during my lifetime. Very briefly, initially on wage and price controls when we used to have them. Almost 50 years ago, I worked for the New Zealand Treasury. In the late 1970s, in the 1980s, I've worked on designing the welfare state, particularly issues around child poverty, and helped draft what is now the Child Poverty Reduction Act, which I'm pleased to say got bipartisan, indeed multi-party support some 6 years ago, and is still in place. But for the last 20 years or so, I've been mostly working on climate change issues. Initially, the whole question of how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and then more recently, how we adapt to the impacts of climate change, which obviously are increasing around the world and locally. So much of the work I've been doing, certainly for the last 5 or 6 years, has been focused on the whole question of how do we prepare for what's coming. I was a member of what was called the Expert Working Group on Managed Retreat or Planned Relocation with Sean in the back. And we spent almost a year, 2022, 2023, producing a report for the Ministry of the Environment, which was published towards the end of last year, on the whole question of how do we prepare for particularly more severe floods and sea level rise, and think about moving people out of harm's way before they are damaged by major weather events or sea level rise. And that work has contributed to the work of the Finance and Expenditure Committee, which produced a report on adaptation just a few months ago, well, in fact, just a month ago, and hopefully will help inform what the government does over the coming months and years. All right, so let me just quickly get into the topic. So I wanted to say a few words about terminology, clarify the question, note some of the main issues, and then get into the heart of what this is all about, which is about allocating benefits and burdens fairly. And then make a few comments about some of the practical considerations and, if you like, values other than justice, which need to be thought about in addressing the big issues of land use change, and offer you a few conclusions. So by way of terminology, I'm focused today on distributive justice, which is really about the just or fair sharing of benefits and burdens, or costs and benefits, or the sharing of rights and duties or responsibilities. Distributive justice is sometimes referred to as social justice, but can also be equated with fairness and equity. So for the purposes of this discussion, and I appreciate some philosophers might disagree with this, but for the purposes of this discussion, I'm using the terms distributive justice, social justice, fairness, and equity more or less interchangeably. Okay? And it's really important to recognise that equity or fairness is not the same as equality. Equality is a principle of fairness and justice. Treating people equally, in some sense, may or may not be fair, depending on the circumstances. People may have different needs, and to treat them the same or equally would thus be potentially unjust. So just bear that in mind as we go. Social justice, distributive justice, fairness, equity, broadly speaking, the same. Your task is essentially 3A on this particular slide. The broad question here is how do we minimise future harm and build a more climate resilient and prosperous economy going forward. And within that, there's the question here about land use changes to minimise environmental harm and reduce long-term social and economic costs. So the question is how do we do that in this region fairly? And that is, of course, part of a much broader question about how we make transitions due to environmental needs or demands, or transitions prompted by massive technological changes, which is another thing that's happening now around the world. How do we make those transitions fair? All right, so in thinking about that question of fair sharing of the costs and burdens of transitions of various kinds, in this case land use change, a variety of issues arise. So the first question would be, well, what are the likely costs, burdens, losses, and so on? And what are the likely benefits and gains? So in thinking about this, we need to be clear about, well, who's going to lose, who's going to benefit, who might lose, who might benefit, and so on. Then there's the question about, well, who could contribute to the costs and help defray some of the losses and burdens. Potentially, therefore, what are the sources of funding to help manage the transition? And then in thinking about how we might answer that question, there's the issue of justice, what are the principles of distributed justice or fairness? And how might we apply those principles? Because it's all very well having specific principles, but there's also the question of how they can be applied in practice, sometimes in complicated situations. And then there's also the question, well, what other values and considerations need to be considered other than considerations of fairness? There might be very practical considerations as to what is actually feasible, or what's it going to cost to do this in this particular way. Something may be fair, but it may not be easy to undertake. So, who could potentially contribute to the cost of land use change in modality over the coming years, decades, and so on? And realistically, there's only a limited number of possibilities. There's the central government, which is essentially you and I as taxpayers, those of us who are paying tax. There's local government. In this case, the Gisborne District Council. And in fact, that means ratepayers. And many of you will be ratepayers here. Then there's the current owners of land and resources that are affected by land use change. So that may be foresters or farmers, maybe just people owning a little bit of land, it may be Māori land, but it's essentially the people who have certain ownership rights and responsibilities. Then potentially there's the use of regulatory mechanisms such as the emissions trading scheme, with carbon credits, or potentially biodiversity credits. So sources of funding provided through a particular regulatory framework which enables funding to flow for good purposes, good environmental purposes, from a range of people locally and nationally, but also potentially internationally. And then finally, there's the potential for philanthropic trusts with private donors to contribute in various ways. And that is happening around the world in terms of a variety of responses to environmental degradation and change. But typically, the amount of money that's available from philanthropic sources is pretty limited. Or you could have some combination. So essentially, 5 main types of funding, or sources of funding, and one of the questions would be, well, what would be a just allocation across these in the context that you're having to address right now? So when we come to, is that all right? Okay, I'll keep going with this one.
Excuse me. The biodiversity.
Yes.
Give me an example of what are you talking about there? Nobody is.
Right. So the basic point here is that having a more diverse ecosystem will produce a variety of benefits. More bird life, reduced erosion of steep hill country, reduced sediment flows, improvement in the fishery downstream as a result of better water quality and so on, and reduced sediment. So potentially you can have a regulatory regime in which some people will contribute to pay for increased biodiversity, and other people who are, if you like, doing the planting or managing that area of biodiversity will receive funding for that purpose. So it's essentially a kind of like an ETS. Well, no, it doesn't have to be taxpayers. It could be companies. It could be individuals.
Is there something that's a possibility of where the biodiversity credit?
Well, it's certainly something that's been under consideration in New Zealand for some time. Others in the room will know more about that than I do. But globally, biodiversity credits have been used now for quite some time. Perhaps we could come back to this specifically.
Just to say, it's exactly these questions, right? So note them as well, because what we're doing by the end of today is to think about what you want to know more about. So clearly, this is part of that, right? What you want to know more about. And next time we meet, we'll really be focused on those potential solutions. So it's really useful to know that. Thank you for
And Yeah, so let's come back to that. Okay. So as we think about distributed justice or fairness, essentially we're thinking about the allocation, on the one hand, of benefits, okay, gains, improvements, rights, and on the other hand, the allocation of burdens, costs, losses, responsibilities. Much of the focus here is really going to be about actually the costs and potential losses. But there may also be benefits, and we need to think about what they might be, and therefore how we should be allocating benefits. When we come to the question of the principles that can be applied to how we should allocate benefits on the one hand and costs on the other, when it comes to benefits, there are essentially egalitarian principles of fairness or justice and non-egalitarian principles. And the two main egalitarian principles, which you will all be familiar with, though you may not have seen them necessarily as egalitarian principles, are first of all the idea that we should treat everyone equally, and secondly the idea that we should give to people on the basis of their need. So the principle of need and the principle of equality are the two main egalitarian principles. And there will be circumstances in which both those principles are going to be relevant to one degree or another. So for example, we believe as Democrats and as people living in a country with civil rights that everyone should have equal civil and political rights. We should have an equal right to contribute to our democracy. We should have equality of voting opportunities, so equal votes or votes of equal value, and so on. But we probably don't think we should all have an absolutely equal income or an absolutely equal amount of wealth. The principle of need is applied in many areas of private and public life. When we're bringing up children, we treat our children differently sometimes because they have different needs. A child with a disability will need more assistance to a child without. I have two daughters. One of them has married someone who earns a vast amount of money. The other married a poor student. And some of you may have struggled with this as parents. If you treat the children equally in that situation, you're not really being fair. So that raises questions. Then there are these non-egalitarian principles of justice, and there are three main ones. The first is that you allocate benefits on the basis of somebody's merit, which might be their virtue, or it might be their innate or learned skills. So we reward people for their skill. Think about sports, for example. We have prizes for really good sportsmen and women, but that's essentially rewarding people on the basis of their skill. Perhaps some other things as well. Then there's the rewarding people on the basis of their contribution. How much have they contributed to a particular exercise? It might be contribution at work, or at home, or at school, whatever it might be. We're essentially focused on their contribution as opposed to their skill. Of course, there may be a connection between skill and contribution, but the aim of the second principle is to reward people on the basis of their contribution. And then the third is to reward people on the basis of how much effort they've made. Somebody may make a huge amount of effort, but only contribute a very little. If you were rewarding them on the basis of their contribution, they get very little. If you reward them on the basis of their effort, however, they will get a lot more. Many of my students over the years thought they should be rewarded in terms of the marks they get on the basis of their effort, not on the basis of the merit. But the problem is for me, I have no idea how much effort they put in. Almost impossible to ascertain. And now, of course, lots of students simply use artificial intelligence and that requires very, very little effort. All right, so that's allocating benefits. Egalitarian principles, non-egalitarian principles, and of course they sometimes conflict, okay? And we therefore have to make trade-offs and decide which principle should we prioritize. Now when it comes to allocating burdens or losses or responsibilities, which is more relevant for this exercise right now, there are, again, a range of principles. And again, most of you will be familiar with these, so sorry to sort of, if this is like sucking eggs, but it needs to be gone through. So first of all, there's the ability to pay. People with a greater capacity to pay on the basis of that particular principle should pay more. And we use that in the tax system. In the income tax system, people who are earning more, assumed to have a greater capacity to pay, are expected to pay a large portion of their income in tax. Then there's the polluter pays principle. This is essentially people who impose a loss on others should bear a bigger burden, a disproportionate burden relative to those who are imposing a smaller loss or no loss on people. Then there's the principle of beneficiaries pay. This is the idea that if you benefited from something, then you have the greater responsibility to contribute to a particular cost or burden than other people. And of course, there may be a connection between the beneficiary pays and the ability to pay. Often the people who have benefited most will also actually have the greatest ability to pay as well because they might have a higher income or more wealth or whatever. Then there's the idea that in fact there should be equal contributions. Simply because we're, say, all equal citizens, we should all contribute equally. Now, that may or may not be sensible, depending on whether or not people have the means to contribute. There was a big debate in the United Kingdom about 4 decades ago when the then Conservative government, led by Margaret Thatcher, wanted every citizen at the local government level to pay an equal amount of a so-called poll tax, irrespective of their income, irrespective of their wealth. And that was her undoing, because lots of people said, well, that's unjust. Why should you expect everyone to pay the same amount, irrespective of their capacity or ability to pay? And then finally, there's the idea that we should all contribute to some degree as members of a public or members of a local community, members of a particular region or whatever. And that might be justified on the basis of some sort of solidaristic principle. We want to be, we feel a responsibility as members of a community to contribute to a communal kind of endeavour, which is designed to benefit the overall community. We might be thinking about how do we manage a particular risk like climate change and take the view that this is a risk that we should share as a community rather than individuals bearing responsibility for dealing with it independently. This idea of a community contribution, public pays. And then, of course, there's a range of combinations of those 5 possibilities. And you should appreciate that these 5 principles can be in tension. And so, again, it's a question of how do we prioritize, how do we rate them, and how do we apply them in different contexts. This slide just basically brings together the benefits on the left-hand side and the burdens on the other, and just shows you how they sort of play out in practice. So, first line is allocating the benefits equally on the one hand, on the other hand, the burden requiring everyone to make an equal contribution. Second line, allocation on the basis of need, on the one hand, on the other hand, allocating on the basis of capacity to contribute, ability to pay, and so on. And I won't go through it all, you can see that. So here's a way in which you can kind of think about sort of 5 principles to allocate benefits and 5 principles to allocate burdens alongside each other. Doesn't answer the question, but it helps you at least think about the kind of principles that are relevant. Now, it's really important to recognize that, first of all, distributed justice is only one of the many kinds of justice. We also have what we call procedural justice, or natural justice, which is about ensuring that any particular process like this is undertaken fairly, that everyone, for example, has an equal opportunity to contribute. So there are principles of natural justice or procedural justice. There are also other principles of justice which are, if you like, a substantive rather than a procedural nature. So, for example, there is the principles in relation to compensatory justice. So think about accident compensation. If you have an accident in the workplace or at home, you may be eligible for ACC support. Now, that isn't so much about distributive justice, it's about compensating for a particular accident or loss, and there are certain rules around who's going to be eligible and rules around what that eligibility will entitle you to. Okay? So there's compensatory justice, which is separate from distributive justice, so it's obviously connected in various ways, and then there's criminal justice or corrective justice, and so on. So, just to say, focus here is on distributive justice, but that's not the only kind of justice that matters. We need to think about how we apply principles in particular contexts. And contexts differ, so to the extent that the differences are significant or relevant, you may apply the same principles differently. So imagine you've got different types of land that has to be changed in various ways, there's different kinds of transitional processes. You might apply the same principles, but in different ways, depending on the context. And if you're trying to decide whether or not you should apply the principles differently, a critical question will be, are the differences kind of morally significant or morally relevant or not? In other words, is this context substantively different from this context, requiring that the same principles are applied differently? Okay, so that's something, again, for you to think about. Just quickly going through some of these other points. Do bespoke arrangements apply? Well, in some cases, in this province, there are going to be Māori land, there may have been some treaty settlements, and it may be that it's absolutely right and proper and justified to treat transitions in relation to that land differently from privately owned land or other kinds of ownership structure. So that's another thing to think about. And there may be different principles to bring to bear in relation to, for example, TTBT and so forth. Then there's the question of feasibility and cost effectiveness. Something may seem to be the most just way of doing it, but it may not be feasible for one reason or another. So you then have to back up and say, okay, well, what's going to be feasible here, and modify what you have in mind accordingly. We should always be thinking about the impacts on different groups when we're thinking about distributive justice, and not just now, but over time. So we need to have a sort of dynamic, intergenerational perspective. We also need to think about how what we do might impact on incentives and behaviours. So we need to be mindful that, sometimes people abuse things or do things differently to what we intended. So we need to bear that in mind in designing any particular policy response. We need to think about not just what we think would be just, but what the rest of society might think is just. Because if we want a particular policy framework to last, to be durable, then it's going to be really important that enough of the community agree with us such that what we do can be maintained over time. Because if we have lots of inconsistencies in the way we treat similar or identical cases, then that would be unjust. Okay? And then, of course, related to that, we need to think about, well, what's, if you like, politically feasible, maybe at the local level, national level, or whatever. So there's a range of factors that need to be considered. There's one other element if I could just bring in, and then I'll wrap up, which is the idea of remedial responsibility. Seems to me that Tairāwhiti is faced with some very, very significant challenges, okay? And it would be morally irresponsible not to make some pretty significant land use changes, given all the damage and suffering that's happened over recent times, and it could happen in the future if we don't change things, okay? But suppose that those who bear most responsibility for changing things lack the means to do so. Suppose you said, okay, it's the landowners that have the most responsibility to make the changes required, and the government can kind of just force them to do that. But what if they lack the means? What then? It's all very well saying, you do X, but if you don't, if X doesn't, if Y doesn't have the means to do X, then you've got a problem. So that then leads to this concept of remedial responsibility, and that is the idea that where the people who perhaps have the most responsibility to act simply don't have the means to act, then those with the means to act have a moral duty to step in and help. Okay? And for practical purposes in New Zealand, at a national level, I mean, that's the central government. The central government is ultimately the entity which has the most means to help in situations where there is significant suffering, significant loss, significant requirements for major change, and so on. So where does that all lead? Well, very simply, what it means from my perspective, looking at the kind of challenges that Tairāwhiti faces over the coming years, I think there's a very strong case for the government, central government, to make a substantial contribution to the transition costs that will arise over the coming years. And I would argue that on the basis of both considerations of distributive justice and on the basis of other relevant considerations. And very quickly, just going through these key points, in terms of distributive justice, I would say, well, the central government actually is partly responsible for the problems that this part of the world faces right now, due to particular policy decisions that were made in the past, a failure to regulate things properly, failure to provide the kind of guidance required, and so on. And so to the extent that the government is responsible, you could say, right, well, there's a kind of a burden of responsibility there that the government should front up to. Secondly, Tairāwhiti is relatively poor in per capita terms by New Zealand standards, so the principle of need would come in here, ability to pay, if you like, and then the Gisborne District Council is also relatively poor and has limited pork borrowing capacity and so on. So for all those sorts of reasons, you would say, right, in terms of distributive justice, there's a significant case, a really good case for the Crown, central government being a significant contributor, and then there's a range of other considerations. So the remedial responsibility issue that I mentioned, the fact that reducing future harm and enhancing the resilience of Tairāwhiti will reduce the Crown's long-term fiscal risk, because if we have disaster after disaster after disaster, well, that will impose significant costs on the central government. In general terms, prevention is better than cure. I think there's a case based on national solidarity with those who have suffered loss, in many cases very significant losses. I think you could apply the principles of Tīwhariti in terms of partnership, protection, participation, redress, and so on, to argue for some Crown contribution. And then there's the issue of compensation for enforced losses. If we're going to basically require certain types of land use change which have a significant impact on the income and equity of the owners of that land, then potentially at least there's a case for compensatory justice as opposed to distributive justice. So that's it in a nutshell. Obviously, there's vastly more that could be said, but I hope that sort of just laid out as clearly as I can the kind of principles that are relevant to your discussions. And very happy to answer a few questions now if you have them, and then there'll be an opportunity for discussion this afternoon as well.
Are there any burning questions right now? Yeah. Yeah. So hands up, just quickly, who has questions? We've got 1, 2, any kind of it?
Jonathan, I'd really like to thank you for an excellent presentation. I've got one big concern. Your work and expertise is obviously forward thinking and not public facing. So is the government going to disestablish your role?
Well, I'm in the very
I'm
in the very fortunate position of being semi-retired, so I'm only employed 1 day a week. So I'm kind of a free agent now, and I don't have to worry. And I can say what I
I just was interested in talking about who should pay for the program of distributive justice, but to keep rolling and why things are the way they are now. So does this discussion need to challenge the current systems that lead us into these paths of injustice?
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you think about human history, over thousands of years, people have drawn on considerations of justice, including distributed justice, to seek to transform their societies. And obviously, as societies have had a greater surplus in the last, say, 200 years, and governments have had greater means to do things as a result of that, obviously there's been a call for governments to do much more in terms of contributing to distributed justice. And we went back 200 years, central governments have very little capacity relative to what they have now. So, I mean, part of the big challenge is, what do people believe a just society should look like? And then how does one pursue that? And I appreciate there are different views about what a just society looks like. And that is evident around the world, even within democracies. You will see, for example, in Scandinavia, governments which have a much larger role in their society with much more redistribution of income and wealth than, say, some other societies like the United States. And I'm not here to persuade you of any particular perspective, but sort of to lay out some of the relevant principles for you to consider in your deliberations.
I guess what I'm thinking of is that we're always trying to move things in spaces with systems that are set up to stay in the frustration and
Sure. Sure. I mean, obviously, in a democracy, people are going to differ with each other, and sometimes getting change is very difficult. Resistance to change, and so on. But I mean, I'm a strong believer in democracy in the sense that I believe that thinking deliberatively, thoughtfully, and drawing on good evidence to ponder what might be a best way forward is something that we ought to do and we can do, and that ultimately, even though there might be resistance to what seems to be the best, we can make progress. So we may not achieve perfect justice, or we won't, but we can move incrementally to something which is more just. And I think we should seek to do that wherever possible.
Any other questions?
Go ahead. Brilliant presentation again. Just one question is, when we look at who is there, and we introduce the concept of who benefits from all, sometimes I see a pattern here where, especially in environmental disasters, where people who benefit, industry benefits, and then who has the more power, taxpayers. Do you mind commenting if something needs to be changed in that respect?
So when we're thinking about who should benefit, or who does benefit, we need to be mindful that people might benefit in different ways. Some people might benefit in terms of income or wealth. Other people might benefit in terms of having simply a more stable, diverse, beautiful environment to live in. So their main benefit is, if you like, in health and well-being, rather than, say, income. But health and well-being matter, okay? So those are benefits. We also need to think that about this from the perspective of not just human beings, but also the rest of the biological world, the rest of all other life forms. And it seems to me we have a duty to, where possible, protect the extraordinary diversity and beauty of the rest of the created order, the natural world. So there's a benefit, if you like, to non-human species that we need to think about as well. I focus today just on, if you like, the human dimension rather than the non-human dimension, but the non-human dimension is not irrelevant. I think all right has intrinsic value, not just like instrumental value. It's valuable in its own right, not just for the benefit of the minds of human beings. Not everyone agrees with that, obviously. And then there's a third aspect of this, which is we need to think about this from an intergenerational point of view. That the things we do today may impose cost on those of us living right now, but for the benefit of people who may be living hundreds of years hence. They can't obviously pay, even though they will benefit. But I think, we do this as parents, as well as I think as citizens. We have a general obligation to seek to, leave the world a better place for the future than what we originally inherited, rather than the worst place. So, key point there is sometimes the beneficiaries of something aren't going to be in a position to pay because they're not alive yet, or they may be alive but they're children and they can't contribute. So it's a complicated thing. I'm sorry, that may not quite answer your question, but this is where, it's complex.
Any other questions just now? Jonathan will be here this afternoon, and so now the idea is we'll get a lot of information, and you've just given us so much. We'll get more, and then bring people back this afternoon to sit in the panel, and it's really interactive with some discussion. So if the question doesn't occur to you now, hold on to it and be more discussion.
And I don't pretend I've got all the answers. Absolutely not. This is a collective endeavour.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you.
So much.
Try something just quickly before the next speaker. This is based on what you just heard from Jonathan. Does everybody have access to a device right now?
You all have your phones.
Wi-Fi?
Yeah. And are you on Wi-Fi?
Wi-Fi is say what is it again?
Yes. The password is remember, but after the B before the R is a 3. The final E is a 3.
And remember all over.
All lowercase.
So if you get online and go to menti.com, just search up MENTI, lowercase.com. We'll have to tell you what the number is.
Menti. MENTI.com.
Just join at menti.com and use code STAR. That's very small. You get a slide with the code when you go to menti.com is 7878 0757.
So just before 7878 0757.
You know, and you should see this. What does fairness mean to you? This is just a starter. This is a word cloud. You can put in a word or a phrase what you think fairness means to you. And if you see someone else pull up on this musical start and you want to use that same phrase, if you like it, you can put it in. Just makes it fair.
So the idea here is, off the back of what Jonathan has just shared with us, that's got us thinking about different ways to think about fairness, different ways it can be framed. But in your own life, some of the examples that he brought up might have made you think of what's going on in your own life. What's a word that fairness means to you? Are there some words that come to mind? Can you think about how do you react to it? What does fairness mean to you? And we'll just, your name doesn't come up on here at all. Just the words that you think of. So take a minute to think that through. Is there a word that you can equate? What does fairness mean to you?
Give me a phrase as well.
And like Ed said, if you see something and you're agreeing with it, you can use that same word. That sort of beefs it up a bit on the screen. And this helps us to see the different words that come to mind for people. What does fairness mean to you? anyone want that? Set that up.
This is just a starter, and we've got a couple more questions that relate more closely to Jonathan.
Does anyone have trouble logging on or want to? Okay, but let's see this again.
So as you can see, equitable, respect, just, are coming out large and in the middle. It doesn't mean other things aren't important. Equity, justice, respect, across the table. Okay, so just bear that in mind, we can come back to it again. I just want to move to next slide. This is a slider on this one. So Jonathan was talking about fair ways to distribute benefits or burdens. This one's thinking about benefits. Questions here. So you can put your mark on the slider. It says how much you agree. So on the left, you strongly disagree with those statements. On the right, you strongly agree. So the top one was benefits should go to everyone equally. How much do you agree on the scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree with that statement?
Can everybody see this? Yeah? And you can see how to toggle your slider over?
So we have benefits should go to everyone equally. Benefits should go to those with the greatest needs. Benefits should be based on merit. They should be based on contribution to positive outcome
So can everybody see this? We're starting to see where the values are falling. Benefits should be based on contribution to a positive output or outcome. Lots of people agree with that. Benefits should be based on effort. That was the merit one that Jonathan brought up. Benefits should go to the greatest need. That's interesting to see that come out quite high, as opposed to benefits should go to everyone equally. This is our starting point, right? This is our first time really thinking this through together and talking about it. So we've got lots of time to learn and to come back to this stuff. Okay, we won't take too much longer with this. But you changed your slide.
Thank you.